So it's all right.
Oh, no worries.
All right. Mike, we are live, sir.
Hey, good morning or good afternoon.
Yeah, you're on the left coast, if it's okay to say that, and I am down here in
Yeah,
beautiful Key West, Florida, so
out in
several
America.
miles apart. That's right. Amen, brother. Amen. For those that don't know, my name is Rich Brown, co-host, co-founder of the American Warrior Society and the American Warrior Show, America's leading self-defense podcast. And I have the great honor and distinct pleasure to have Mike Wood on the show today. I'll go ahead and read Mike's bio before we get into the show. Mike is a graduate of the United States Air Force Academy, a graduate of the U.S. Army Airborne School, and a retired Air Force Instructor Evaluator pilot. He is the author of Newhall Shooting, a tactical analysis, the highly acclaimed study, the 1970 California Highway Patrol gunfight in Newhall, California, and wrote the tactical analysis column at police1.com for 8 years. Mike is the senior editor at revolverguy.com and an active instructor in both the law enforcement and armed citizen communities. He's a prior guest of ours here at the American Warrior Show podcast, and we're very happy to have him back on the show. Mike, welcome back, brother.
Thank you, sir. It's been a while. I looked just the other day to figure out how long it's been. I was on show 111, and I think it was 154 or something. So you guys have covered a lot of ground since then.
Yeah, we just keep chugging along. Nobody's fired us yet.
Yeah, that's great. Well, it's a pleasure to be back with you and with the audience. So a great group of folks here. Glad to be with you.
Thank you, sir. We got Tony on. Says good afternoon. Johnny King says good afternoon, gentlemen from Kentucky. Gentlemen, great to have you on the show. Please like and hit that share button if you would. Yeah, we brought you out the first go around. I think maybe it was the first go around. We talked about Newhall. I don't think your book had come out at that point, had it?
It had. It had been out for a little while. So yeah, we talked about some lessons, and there was much to talk about. We came back for a second helping a little bit later. So.
And you're over at Revolver Guy as well. And I believe, did you start that with my good buddy, Justin Carroll?
I sure did. Well, the truth is Justin started it, and then I jumped on probably about 3 to 4 months into it. And we worked on it together for quite a long time, about 4 years together. And then Justin got very interested in pursuing some other interests with the Swift Silent Deadly blog that he's been working on, and some other projects with you. And he got very busy starting a new career. And so his interests went a different direction, and I just kind of kept the skids greased at Revolver Guy. And that's been a good 4 years now that I've kind of been running that. And so Justin is the birthright for the blog, but we worked on it together for a while, and I've kept it going.
It just goes to show what a tiny, tiny community this really is. You also know my co-host on the Monday morning show, Will Wood. You and him know each other, and you and Justin know each other, and of course it's just like none of it. Yeah. Fate put it all together or something.
Well, yeah, we all in these same circles, right? Our community that we're in is rather selective and rather small when you get right down to it. And so it's not surprising that we run into each other. And, you could play that 7 degrees of Kevin Bacon game. I could probably play 3 degrees of Rich Brown and know just about everybody in this community here.
Yeah, it's funny. I got my introduction to combat handgun shooting, whatever you want to call it, when I went to the Marine Corps high-risk personnel course up in Quantico. And one of the brand new instructors there was a young sergeant named Ernest Langdon. And I was a corporal at the time. And I ran into him at NRA a couple years ago. And I said, you were one of the instructors there. I came back and taught Seeklander what I learned at that school, and it got us both going into the combat handgun shooting 32 years ago. I said, so you might be like the godfather of a lot of people in this community.
Yeah, it's amazing the way that people have the influence that they do, right? You know, you get a guy with a powerful idea and some skill and some talent at being able to teach, and you throw that pebble in the water, and those ripples go really far toward the edge of that pond.
Yeah, no question about it. We got Dr. Gordon Botson on up there in Ohio, coin number 1688. My brother Jeff Brown must be in the other room. Says, "Are revolvers the ultimate gun Amish?" Have you heard that term?
I have not heard that term.
So John Correa was making fun of people, and John Correa is a friend, but he was making fun of people saying that people that don't have red dots on their pistols are gun Amish. So I ran out and bought gunamish.com. I'm the proud owner of that website.
I prefer to think myself as a Luddite for not having any of that tech.
yeah, definitely. But yeah, so it's such a small community. And somebody asked me, a younger guy said, how long have they been shooting, you know, modified isosceles and thumbs forward kind of stuff? And I said, I don't know, man. I learned it, and I thought it was old school back in 1990. It's like that long? And I'm like, yeah, bro. Combat handgunning has been around for
back in the whole 1900s, huh?
Exactly. Exactly. Alan Kelly is on. So he says, "Good afternoon, gents. 1581 from occupied Virginia."
Hi there. I'm from occupied California. Welcome aboard.
Yeah. I don't know how you do it, but that's a whole nother podcast in and of itself, Mike.
You'd have to have the beautiful Mrs. Wood on to discuss that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I hear you on that one, brother. Let's jump into the show, man. I took from a good friend of mine over at Defenders and Disciples, great gun/Christian community over there that Taylor's got. He asked these icebreaker questions. I mean, obviously he's not the first one to do it, but I'm like, when he had me on his show, I'm like, these are pretty thought-provoking, and maybe, you know, puts our guests in a different frame of mind before we get to the meat of what they're known for. But what's the best piece of advice you've ever been given, Mike?
Oh, good Lord. I guess one thing I might kind of default to, for lack of anything better, is that when I started my career as a young pilot in the military, we were taught a framework for addressing emergencies. And the first step of that framework is to maintain aircraft control. And after that, you analyze the problem, and then you take appropriate actions at that point. And I think that maintain aircraft control is probably pretty good advice for people. Those of you that might be fans of Rudyard Kipling's poetry, you might remember his poem "If," and he discusses, if you can keep your head while those about you are losing theirs, then you're a man, my son. And I think that maintain aircraft control is probably pretty good advice. You know, we're all going to face stress, terrible situations, and things like that. But if you can keep your head, you stand a pretty good chance of being able to get through things and work through problems. You know, you lose your head, your chances are not so great. So I think that's probably pretty good advice. Maintain aircraft control in your life. The rest will follow.
I think it's fantastic. Now, did you retire from the Air Force, or?
I did. I did a combination of active duty service and reserve service, and not counting my time at the academy, I did a little over 22 years worth of time, and was proud to retire in 2013. Good Lord, it's been a long time. I can't believe it's gone that quick. So, but it goes fast. It goes real fast, doesn't it?
Yeah, I retired in 2012. You're absolutely right. Sometimes I look back and go, 12 years, my God. I don't know any. Well, there's one guy, buddy of mine, is retiring as a colonel after 30-something years. Dennis coming up real soon. And other than him, I think he'll be the last of us that I knew when I was on active duty. Well,
in a couple of weeks, we're going to have the farewell for the aircraft that I spent my career in, the KC-10, and that it's going to have its last flight, and it's going to go off to the boneyard and done. And so all of us old farts are going to get together and talk about the old days and watch the old airplane go out the door and everything. And that will be fun. It'll be fun to see everybody. But I imagine that the course of 10 or 11 years, going to see some changes in some of those guys when I go back.
Oh, I would say so. You don't happen to know Rudy, do you? Rudy Kaspar?
I do not. No, we haven't come across each other.
Yeah, he's an AWS member as well. We've had him on the show. He's a retired Air Force colonel. He was a special operations pilot flying C-130s.
Okay.
Great guy.
Great.
Great guy.
Yeah.
Let's see. What books are you reading right now, Mike?
Well, the one I'm reading, I'm going through right now is Leroy Thompson's book. It's called The World's First SWAT Team. And it's about the Shanghai Municipal Police, Fairburn, William Fairburn, and the development of the special squads that he had for the Shanghai Municipal Police. Just get started on it, and it's been fascinating so far. Kind of a retroactive look at Shanghai and China of the period, and it's been a lot of fun so far. But I'm really looking forward to getting into it because Fairburn, of course, was such an influential person in our world, and so it's fun to get the story about the beginning of his career. So he's a tough old bird, I tell you. He was not a young man when he was policing there in Shanghai, but he was definitely kicking butt and taking names. So, and had quite influence on the development of combat training in the Marine Corps. And by virtue of the fact that the U.S. Marine Corps was stationed abroad doing operations in China. And so his contact with the Marine Corps had quite an influence on development of their tactics and their skills that they taught their personnel. So kind of a neat guy with a neat story.
Yeah, he was influential in training the first OSS guys during World War II. Is that correct?
Absolutely. Yeah. Rex Applegate basically learned from Fairburn, and Fairburn had a compatriot in his training, and they were teaching the English commandos. And then when the Americans wanted to establish their own commando school, we started sending people over there so that they could learn things from them, and that basically became the fruition of the OSS. And so Applegate was at the forefront of bringing those skills from overseas to the American forces. And Fairburn even came to the United States and did training with us here and everything. So, but yeah, a very, very influential guy. And so it's going to be really fun to learn more about his escapades and Shanghai and the beginning of all that. A lot of folks may know Fairburn book, Shooting to Live, where he kind of described his training program for teaching young recruits how to do combat shooting. And it was essentially a body indexed shooting program. I don't want to say point shooting because that has all kinds of connotations today that people have put on it that kind of distract from the conversation. But he had a couple hours to teach people how to go fight some really bad opponents, and very, very rudimentary logistics capabilities. Didn't have a whole lot of ammunition, didn't have a whole lot of time to train people. So you had to come up with a program. Of course, 2 hours, here's your gun training, go out and do good and kill the bad guys. And so it's pretty fascinating what he was able to accomplish with all that.
Yeah, there's a couple things I'd want to highlight on this. If you're a certain age, you're probably familiar with Leroy Thompson. He was certainly a very influential writer back when all we had in our community was Paladin Press. And
Yep.
That's where I came across a lot of the old Fairburn stuff back in the day. I remember, I think Michael Janich got to interview him back in some point, maybe the late 70s, early 80s. And
Yeah.
he was asking Mr. Fairburn, you know what, sir, we did some testing and your timetable of death that you put in one of the books, and as not medically accurate. He's like, said basically what you said. He said, I had just a little bit of time, to get these OSS guys ready before they go there. I'm taking an accountant or something like that and saying, yeah, if you cut here, they're going to be dead in 90 seconds. And really, it was just about, giving them confidence with the tools that they had to go out and take some risks and things of this nature. And so it's an interesting perspective. I'm glad it's not being lost to history. People should study that.
Yeah, Janich worked pretty closely with Applegate in Applegate's later years. And so Applegate was influential in some of Janich's early work. I think Mike wrote a book called was it bullseyes don't shoot back or something like that?
Mhm.
If I'm am I remembering properly? But it was kind of an exploration of the applicate techniques for body index shooting and things like that. And so it was very interesting.
Yeah, it looks comical today for those of us, that running around with a gun in our waistband. But given its time and some of the other things, you have to put everything in the appropriate context. If not, you're misunderstanding, which is again, you can in the age we live in now, you can splice up anything and show something and like, oh, Rich Brown said, okay, bro, it's out of context,
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we lose a lot of context in today's age, right? Because we have the
Mhm.
attention span of gnats,
Yes.
social media and everything like that. I remember that was one of my biggest frustrations back when I was doing a lot of writing at Police One. I'd go write a 2,000 word article and they'd say, that's too long. We need 600 words. And I'd say, well, I can't even get through the introduction in 600 words here, Well, but our readers won't stick around for more than 30 seconds to read the article. So we got to make it short. Well, you can have a choice. You can deliver quality material that will grip somebody's attention and they'll actually learn something from it, or you can have sound bites and they can walk away with nothing, just junk food information. And that's kind of the world that we live in right now, which is why I enjoy Revolver Guys so much. I'm writing for the world's greatest editor myself. And so if I want to write 10,000 words on something, I write 10,000 words on something. And if you don't want to read it, you don't have to read it. But I'm going to write it because it's going to be the way that I want it to be. And so I really enjoy the freedom being able to work at Revolver Guy and not have to submit my work to another editor anywhere. That's really nice.
Yeah. Dwayne is on, says, Mike, looking forward to the podcast. Tony says, when faced with a crisis, wind your watch, man. That's good. We've had ER docs in here said some of the things, in a crisis, take your own pulse first. Rasmic Gold members on. Scott says, good afternoon from mid-Michigan, coin number 2489. Rasmic says, good morning, everyone. 1691 from occupied California. Tim is on. Aloha from Hawaii. You're doing well out there, Tim. What book do you think changed your life the most? Is there one that you can look towards saying, man, that was impactful?
Well, it would have to be the Holy Bible for me. And I don't manage to live up to its precepts every day. I always fail in some way. That gives me something to shoot for and a guide, right? So, to me, that's the most influential book I've ever read. There have been other books that have been important to me for personal or professional reasons, but that's the one that's had the most impact on my life.
If you had an opportunity to teach just one class on one thing, what do you think it would be, Mike?
Oh, I don't know. I do a lot of teaching. I work with a company that does contract training for law enforcement up and down California here, and so we're teaching everything from active shooter response instructor training to less lethals to diversionary devices and patrol rifle instruction and all that. And so I do a lot of teaching at the gun club. I do a lot of teaching for the guys. But I think the thing that I enjoy the most when I'm teaching is I really enjoy taking that brand new shooter that's never had any gun experience and getting them started on their first steps. And I really enjoy doing that. I think there are so many programs and people out there that, in my opinion, are doing it wrong and put the wrong emphasis on things. And so I really enjoy being able to take that clay and start to mold it and send them off in a direction that I think is going to be helpful for them as they go forward. And so I love seeing that spark in their eyes when they get it, and when they're excited about it, they're having fun. That difference between the guy that walks through the door and the guy that walks out at the end of the day, measuring their confidence and being able to manipulate the firearm, and just to see the joy and the fun that they're having with it. And so I really enjoy working with those brand new shooters like that. We do a course out at my club once a month. It's a brand new shooter day. It's a free course that we do for the public as a service to bring people in and help them become more proficient and safe. And I really enjoy working with those students like that. It's not that it's not fun to work with the experienced officers and the more advanced practitioners. There's value and and boards to doing that too. But it's fun to take those new shooters and give them their first steps on the journey.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that goes back to context too. I had a really thoughtful conversation with a firearms trainer, I don't know, a couple weeks ago, and he had put something out. It was a very abbreviated safety points of safety for a firearm, and I thought, okay. I mean, I don't agree with it. Well, why not? So, well, it's not contextually appropriate. I mean, unless you're teaching just known distance, flat range. If the context is defensive shooting, then you're missing one or two things. And we went round and round about that. But I think, again, it goes back to context is important. What are we trying to accomplish? What is the context with which this firearm will be used? And it may be the person that's learning may have no intention of deadly defensive force as a use case for that firearm, which is somewhat an anthem of maybe me and you and the people that we train. But for some folks, there's a great example. My buddy TC talks about where he went to a class and they put T-shirts on the targets. And the guy was like, no mas, don't want no part of it. You can have my guns. I'm not gonna never shoot someone.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. You're in the wrong class, pal.
Definitely in
Too
the wrong
smart
class.
enough to realize it, right?
Yeah.
There's a lot of garbage that gets sold to people, and folks that have been around the business long enough. We've seen all those cycles come and go, right? You were talking earlier about how long have people been using whatever sausage technique or whatever, and it's kind of fun for us to see that cycle where things are always kind of coming and going, and some new kid discovers something that's brand new to him, and he's got to tell the world about it and everything, and it's probably the third or fourth cycle that you've seen of that come past. So
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's like hey coach, yeah, in jiu-jitsu, like, hey coach, not to me, but I'm over here in this, and it's like, what if I took an omoplata and I put my foot here? Oh, I just discovered something. Like, it's a go plata, brother. It's been around forever. Nothing new under the sun.
Yeah, there's nothing new.
So tell me about, Mike, obviously you wrote Newhall Shooting, a tactical analysis, survival lessons from one of a law enforcement's deadliest shootings. Before we kind of talk about the topic, which I hope a lot of people listening to us today are familiar with, if not, you definitely should be, but what drew you to this topic first off?
Well, I grew up as the son of a highway patrolman. My dad was a highway patrolman for 30 years in California, and he got his start in January of '68. And so this shooting happened just a couple of years into his career. And this was one of those events that was very important and significant milestone, not only for his agency, but for law enforcement across the United States. And so a lot of things changed after this event with respect to agency culture and training and skill development and equipment and so forth. And so this was formative for him as a young officer just starting out in his career. And we lived in an area of California that would require us periodically to go past the actual gunfight location, way to and from various things. And there wasn't a time that we passed through it where there wasn't some kind of comment about Newhall and what happened there. And my brother and I were young men interested in following our dad's footsteps into the law enforcement profession. So we were kind of hungry for information and knowledge about it. And so Newhall was just kind of part of my experience growing up. It's just one of those things that I learned about. And one thing that kind of dissatisfied me as I grew older and was reading the gun magazines and everything. And, you mentioned kind of grew up in that area where our source of information was the gun magazines, right? We didn't have the internet and everything else to share information with our tribe. We did that through the gun magazines. And I was increasingly dissatisfied with, the references that I would see to Newhall and the gun magazines. And I wasn't quite satisfied that the people that were writing about it the most really knew what happened there. And so it just kind of got an itch to learn more about it, to research it, and to write about it. I was deployed at the time with the Air Force overseas, and in between missions, there wasn't a whole lot to do but sit around and, waste time while you're waiting to do the next mission. And so I kind of wanted to use the time productively. And so I started writing, and I really had no idea what I was kind of taking on. Actually, some of it started as just writing down some of the stories that my dad had told when we were growing up from his experience on the patrol, because he had passed away not long after retiring. And so I thought, for posterity, I ought to write down some of these stories. And when the Newhall one came around, I thought, that'd probably be a pretty good thing for me to look into a little bit deeper. So kind of a confluence of different events there led me towards researching it and writing about it. And I really had no idea what I was going to do with it after I was done writing. I wanted to write for the purpose of writing, but I really didn't know how to publish, or had no intention or idea how to go out and tell the great world my story about Newhall. But through friends in the industry that I trained with and everything, I was introduced to folks that were able to help me get it published, and just kind of took off. And that became a springboard for me to spend a long time writing in the public's eye over at Police One, and that worked out well for a while until we had a difference of opinion about how things should be done. And during the George Floyd protests, I was very dissatisfied with the way that they were doing certain things from an editorial standpoint, and I felt like I wasn't comfortable being associated with them any longer because of what they were doing editorially. And so we agreed to part ways there. But yeah, it was an interesting period doing a whole bunch of writing about law enforcement stuff. I haven't been doing quite so much of that in the interim. I've been doing a lot more work over at Revolver Guy, but I still dip my toes into those waters now and then. I write some stories over at Revolver Guy that are kind of little mini Newhall shooting experiences. Did some case studies of Scott Goodell's shooting in New York, and some other shootings and notable law enforcement shootings and lessons that we should learn from them. So it's hard to kind of get it out of my blood.
Well, that's amazing. I didn't know the backstory of that. So for those that are not familiar with it, and Dwayne says every LE trainer should read this book, so many lessons to learn that have been forgotten or repeated. Yeah. And those lessons were earned in blood at the expense of 4 young officers. And if you just to look at the black and white photo of those officers laid out across the ground with their shiny shoes pointed toward the sky and the blanket around them. I remember that being seared into my head when I first heard about the story. It might have been right when I was a police officer, but just being, my God, because I think 2 of those officers were Vietnam vets. Maybe one of them was a Marine or something. I may have gotten that wrong.
Yeah, it was a difficult time, right? That picture that those officers laying out on the tables at the morgue was pretty shocking for the profession, and it really hit home the seriousness of the job and the risks that are associated with it. And that picture circulated far and wide within the law enforcement community. It's very impactful. If I can momentarily like to back up and just note Dwayne that made the comment there. One of the best writers that you'll still find over at Police One. So highly recommend folks take a look at his work. He's done the Lord's work over there, and I appreciate the fact that he's still doing great stuff for them over there.
Yeah, that's awesome. Maybe I'll definitely have to check it out if maybe Dwayne is the person I think he is. So for those that don't know, that haven't heard the 2 other instances where we've had you on the show, Mike, give us a backstory to Newhall, kind of paint us a Cliff Notes version of what happened there, if you don't mind, sir.
Okay. Yeah. The real short version is, the best as I can get through it, is that you had 2 violent felons that had been in and out of prison their entire lives for a series of bank robberies and assaults and so forth. Them had killed people before in the course of their time, either as inmates or in their criminal escapades prior to landing in jail. And these 2 guys got paroled through our wonderful system. And instead of spending all their rest of their lives rotting away in jail, they got paroled and when they got out, they decided they would get back into the bank robbery and the armored car robbery business together. And so one evening on April 5th, 1970, these guys were out and about on California's highways, and they got into kind of a road rage incident with a motorist out there. They cut off a motorist, and the motorist, shook his fist at him and convinced them to pull over, and he was going to give them a piece of his mind. And one of the bad guys wound up pointing a gun at our motorist and convinced him that it was a pretty good idea for him to move along. So our motorist pulled in the contact to police, said, "Hey, guy just pointed a gun at me. Here's the description of the car. Here's the license plate. Got to go get this guy." And so the highway patrol started looking for these folks and found them. And initially there was one car with two officers in it that was following this vehicle. And they started to formulate a plan where they were going to link up with a second car of two officers, and the two cars, 4 officers totals, would pull over these bad guys and have a discussion with them about this brandishing incident. And what happened is, before they were able to get the second car of highway patrolmen together to join the chase, the bad guys exited the freeway, and they forced a confrontation with the 2-man car that stopped them. And that 2-man car, composed of 2 officers by the name of Gore and Frago, they made some bad tactical decisions in the way that they approached that vehicle. And in very short order, both of those officers were murdered in a close range ambush by one of the 2 felons that was in the car. And just as the second officer, Officer Gore, was hitting the ground, that second car of highway patrolmen that had been trying to link up with them to make the stop initially arrived on scene, and they drove right up into a close range ambush themselves. And that car was containing Officers Pence and Allen. And Officers Pence and Allen had a running gunfight that lasted several minutes with these bad guys. And in the end, both Officer Pence and Allen were murdered by these 2 felons who managed to hop in their car and drive away from the scene. And they were caught later down the road by sheriff's deputies from LA County. And one of them committed suicide after a hostage situation. And then the other one was caught at a roadblock, and he spent his life in prison and until he hung himself in prison later on. And but the shooting was shocking to the sense of the highway patrol as well as the nation. How could 2 bad guys outnumbered by 4 officers get away and kill these 4 officers? And we hadn't seen a shooting like this in modern law enforcement history, where we'd lost so many officers in a single confrontation. And so it was a shock to the highway patrol. It was a shock to the law enforcement profession. And it caused a lot of soul searching within the profession about, what are we doing wrong? How could this happen? And so we'll talk a little bit about some of those lessons coming up, but that's kind of the bare bones of what happened that night.
And if I remember correctly, they were scouting, correct me if I'm wrong, Mike, they were like scouting for some dynamite on the side of the road that might have been in a locker or something like that they could use to facilitate another robbery or something like that.
Right. So this was kind of an early period in California's motoring history, where we were still building the interstate system in California. And so now the Interstate 5 runs north-south through California and up and down the left coast. It was still under construction in a lot of parts. And so to get through the mountain terrain up there, there was a lot of blasting that was being done to create road access. And so there are a lot of construction sites that way that had explosives on site. And so these guys knew that, and they were hoping to find some of this dynamite and steal it so that they could use it in armored car robberies. So they were up there scouting for that dynamite.
But it shows the level of technical expertise. Not that they were skilled in gunfighting at any stretch of the imagination. And that's part of, I think, the thing that shocks me about it is, just the will that they had, the indomitable will to win and it overcome a lot of the training, because I think at least, it seems to me, I read 2 of the officers were military veterans, at least. I don't remember.
There was some discussion about that, and I wasn't able to really verify some of that in my research. There have been some other discussions about the relationships between the officers, that perhaps Gore and Frago had been childhood friends and so forth. And some of my research kind of seemed to debunk that a little bit, that they met each other as highway patrolmen at the academy. So there's still a couple unknowns in some of the backgrounds for some of those guys. So.
What about
the bulk of my research took me in another direction, so I didn't spend too much time investigating some of that.
I want to, before I get into, I think, I want to talk to you about some of the lessons we can learn on this, because that's what your book is about, a tactical analysis and the lessons we can kind of take away from this. But it would seem to me that something that's relevant to our discussion today would be that a motorist, I believe, passing by, either a former Marine or an active duty Marine, pulls over and takes an officer's gun off the ground, or he starts shooting at the bad guys. Can you walk us through that?
Yeah, absolutely. So at one stage of the gunfight, we'd had 2 officers killed in that first ambush. And so the second car of officers, Pence and Allen, show up on scene, and they start engaging a gunfight with these felons. At one point, Officer Pence is fighting from the rear left quarter panel of his vehicle, and he's firing his revolver from that position, taking cover behind it, trying to engage bad guys. And Officer Allen is on the next car over to his right, and he's fighting from the rear of his vehicle as well. First with a Remington 870 shotgun, and with his revolver. And Officer Allen falls with very grievous injuries from a shotgun blast that he received from one of the felons during this fight. And
he was using one of the CHP. He was using one of the CHP shotguns, wasn't he? Wasn't the shotgun he brought with him? Was it?
The bad guy actually shot him with the shotgun that they had brought to the scene.
Okay.
And they did steal the CHP shotgun later, and that came into use at the hostage situation that occurred after their flight from the scene. But at this point, they were not using the CHP shotgun yet. They did shoot some rounds from a revolver that they stole from one of the CHP officers there. And as an aside, you talked about the preparation of these guys. Not only were they scouting for dynamite, they were also out in the hills testing a walkie-talkie communication system, and they were also doing a bunch of impromptu target shooting out there with a car full of guns. And so when these 2 felons were stopped by our highway patrolmen, they had a car full of loaded guns. And so in this gunfight, every time they ran out and ran dry, they just simply fished into the car and pulled out another loaded gun and continued their fight. And so they had quite a supply of weapons to be able to fight with. But anyhow, Officer Allen is down at this point in the fight with very, very bad injuries. And a former Marine by the name of Gary Kness is going to work, drives by the scene, sees the gunfight occurring, and his first reaction is that he thinks that a movie is being filmed, that they have some kind of Hollywood production going on. And he very quickly realizes that, no, this isn't a movie. This is real. And so he has no weapon himself, but he's driven the scene to try to help in any way that he can. And so during a relative lull in the fight, where Officer Allen went down, Kness sprints from his position about approximately 30 or 40 yards away, and he runs into the middle of this active gunfight to drag the wounded officer to a position of cover, because where he had fallen, he was exposed from his cover. And so Gary Kness tried to drag Officer Allen to a position of safety so that he couldn't be shot at anymore. And in the process, he comes under fire from the man that had just shot Allen. And so Gary starts to look around for a weapon, and he sees Officer Allen's shotgun on the ground. He picks it up and aims it at the bad guy and pulls the trigger, and the weapon's empty. But fortunately, just the act of pointing the gun at this bad guy as he was advancing on was enough to cause the bad guy to retreat to a position of cover. And so when he realizes that the shotgun's empty, Gary searches around for another weapon, and he finds Alan's revolver on the ground. He picks it up. And by this time, our bad guy decides to try to assault their position again. He comes out from behind cover and advances on the fallen officer and the citizen that's helping him. And Gary is able to fire the one round that was remaining in the revolver and injure the bad guy. And he drove him off. He didn't create a serious wound, but the guy got hit by a little bit of frag, and it kind of deterred him from wanting to press the attack anymore. And from that point in the gunfight, the bad guy's sole objective was to escape the scene. So he didn't engage in any more gunfire at that point. He just began to try to flee the scene after getting that frag from Gary. So, Gary was a hero, and not many folks, I think, would jump into the middle of an active running gun battle with no weapon themselves and try to assist. But he was a warrior, and he did that.
Question.
And so he did everything that he could with the limited resources that he had, and he did manage to turn the battle there for a little while. So
yeah, that's outstanding. Craig is on. Craig is over in the UK. Good evening from the home of the Redcoats.
Sorry, brother.
Doing well. Yeah, I'm sorry about that. Hope you're doing well over there. Yeah, no kidding. You got some problems over there, Craig. Keep your head down. Don't be posting on Facebook, Craig. Get yourself in trouble. Let's see. Going back to the shotgun that I forget which officer it was that had it on his hip as he's kind of at a port arm, modified port arms, walking up to make the traffic stop, if I remember correctly. And that ends up being a bad move for him. And I want to say that shotgun was later used to commit suicide by one of the scumbags who was held up on that hostage situation, right?
Yeah. So that first car officers, the first two officers that stopped the two bad guys in the car was manned by officers Gore and Frago. Gore was the driver, and Frago was the passenger officer. And so Gore and Frago had some communication gaps that must have been there that we can infer from their actions, because this was a stop where we had a gun involved, and the two officers kind of chose a set of tactics that were inconsistent. And so one officer was running a set of tactics that would have been more consistent with their training for a simple misdemeanor stop. And then the other officer was running a set of tactics that would have been more consistent with what they called a hot stop at the time, later a felony stop. Mm-hmm. And so Officer Gore went forward to the vehicle to extract the driver and the passenger. And Officer Frago remained behind at the CHP cruiser in kind of an overwatch position with the shotgun. But then for reasons that we don't understand, Officer Frago elected to leave that cover position at the CHP cruiser and advance on the felon's vehicle so that he could extract the passenger from the vehicle. And as he approached the passenger side door of that vehicle, he had the Remington 870 holding it around the receiver with his right hand, and he rested the butt of the shotgun on his right hip, right above where his revolver was as well. He's a right-handed officer. And so he was reaching for the door handle with his left hand, and he basically had his right hand occupied holding a shotgun in a manner that it couldn't be fired, and in a manner that he couldn't access his revolver either. And so he left himself particularly vulnerable to the range attack, the ambush that was launched when the bad guy popped out of the car with a .357 and shot him. And that shotgun fell right there where Officer Frago fell, and it was later recovered by the bad guys in the fight. And when they fled the scene, they fled with that CHP shotgun. And the one bad guy, as I mentioned, later became involved in a hostage incident at a home that was located a couple miles away from the scene. And after several tear gas assaults by the LA County SWAT team, early SEB team, he committed suicide with that CHP shotgun.
That's tough. So,
Yeah.
and thank you for that, Mike, for that very well done abbreviated version. So, when you think back on the book you wrote, the Tactical Analysis, if there were top 3 lessons for Leos of the 21st century, I mean, I hate to do that, pigeonhole you that way, but is there 3 that kind of leap to mind that you would?
Yeah, and we'll talk about them quickly here. I'll kind of refer guys to the previous episodes where we talk about these things in detail. But I think instead of going too deep into the low level tactical issues, I'd kind of like to talk about some of the bigger issues with it from the law enforcement side. And so from the top level thing, one of the things that I want to talk about that's particularly important in today's world is the importance of agency culture. And so the Highway Patrol of 1970 was an agency that wanted to encourage an officer-friendly persona. They wanted their officers to be seen as helpful, friendly public servants. They didn't want them to be involved too much in the nitty-gritty work of law enforcement. And so as a result, they created an agency culture where officers were punished for appearing too aggressive in their dealings with the public. So, for example, if an officer were to make a stop on a vehicle and he had some reason to believe that there was a risk to his safety, and he placed his hand on a gun as he approached the vehicle, which would be a reasonable precaution. If the motorist complained to Highway Patrol that the officer approached with his hand on his gun, that officer would be punished for it and would receive days off of pay and would be punished for it. And that was the culture that these officers operated in at the Highway Patrol in 1970. The shotguns we mentioned, they had a paper seal that would be placed, that would be like an adhesive seal, would be wrapped around the fore end of the shotgun and over the top of the barrel. And it had a perforated line on the seal, so that if shotgun's action was racked, it would break this paper seal, and it would be an evident sign that the weapon had been loaded by the officer. And in the CHP culture of the time, if you broke the paper seal on the shotgun by loading the chamber of a shotgun because you felt it was necessary to do that for your safety, you had to write a memo about it to explain and justify why it was necessary for you to get the shotgun out and why it was necessary for you to load it. And a sergeant would have to come to the scene and remove the paper seal, take your memo, and then reapply a new paper seal to properly safe the gun for storage again. And as you can imagine, this type of protocol discouraged officers from wanting to use the most important, powerful weapon in their arsenal when it was necessary. And it created a culture, again, where officers were hesitant to take normal, reasonable precautions to protect their safety and the safety of the public because they didn't want to deal with the administrative issues that were involved with it. And so that was the agency culture that these 4 young officers that died that night were operating in. And we see when we look at the things that they did at that crime scene, we see evidence of that kind of hesitance that they had and their resistance to using aggressive, forceful tactics with 2 guys that obviously deserved it. And so I think that agency culture of the time led to these officers making decisions that affected their safety in very dramatic ways. And concern that I've been talking about for ever since I wrote this book back in 2012 is that we're creating the condition for a new Newhall in today's law enforcement. You know, we don't put paper seals on shotguns anymore, but we've got officers all over the nation that are living under DOJ consent decrees and things like that that make them hesitant to do normal, reasonable things to protect their safety. You know, if you draw a weapon these days out of your holster in many agencies, including many in my vicinity here, that requires a use of force memorandum, you know, and that's the modern day.
Draw your weapon? to draw your
Sure.
weapon.
Yeah. Yeah. If you draw a weapon out of your holster, that requires a use of force memo in some of these agencies. Go to Oakland PD out here in the Bay Area, still suffering under the DOJ consent decree. That's standard protocol. And so, we don't put paper seals on shotguns or patrol rifles anymore, but we've got our own modern day paper seals that we make our officers suffer with, And we've seen ever since, you can set the milepost anywhere you like, call it the last 10 years to be generous. We've seen in the last 10 years, the nature of policing in America has radically changed, right? And we see these officers are being asked to go to work in cultures and environments where they know they don't have the support of the public. They don't have the support of their chain of command. The slightest mistake will get them in trouble, not just with their department administratively, but maybe land them in a court of law somewhere, where they have to justify their use of force and in a court system that is biased against them. And so, we have a lot of officers these days that are operating in a culture very much like these officers in 1970, where they are hesitant to do the things that are reasonable and necessary to provide for their safety. And that subjects them to a lot of additional danger and also makes them obviously very less effective as law enforcement officers as well. They're afraid to do things to protect themselves. So that certainly makes the public that they serve even more vulnerable,
100%
agree. So that is a big lesson, I think, of Newhall that we don't talk about enough. And I think that we're creating conditions in modern law enforcement right now that are very, very dangerous for our officers and for the public that they serve. And that's culturally and that we need to fix as Americans. That's not necessarily just an agency thing. The agencies certainly have a big role to play in that, right? We've seen too many shootings and too many officer-involved use of forces over the last decade where the moment that something becomes a public story, the chief or the sheriff is there to throw their officer or deputy under the bus, and they're not there to protect them, to provide them the benefit of the doubt, to wait until the investigation is complete before they're making comments about what the officer did and didn't do. And so there's a lot of agencies that are deficient, and they're a culture where they're not showing proper support for their officers and they're not using good leadership. And so the agencies certainly have a big role in this, but there's something even larger beyond the agencies, right? We need to be looking at mayors, we need to be looking at city councils, we need to be looking at county board of directors, we need to be looking at our elected officials, we need to be looking at our courts, and we need to be asking why we are allowing ourselves to have this system, this greater system that is not supportive of the people that we're sending out daily to enforce the laws of our society. And that leads into much larger conversations when we talk about later in the podcast. But I think that's one of the really big lessons of Newhall that we don't talk about a lot.
No, I think that's perfect, Mike. I did not remember that culture existed, and it's shocking how history repeats. Let me get to some of the comments here. Craig says, Craig over there in the UK, let me get back to his comment here. We call the bad guy suicide divine justice. No kidding. Especially the fact that it was used, he used that officer shotgun. I love that part of the story. Will Wood says, hey guys, sorry I'm late. Will Rhodes is now on from Missouri. So is Gerald out there in Oregon. The John Hearn is on. Hello, John. He says, amen on setting the stage for a near-term Newhall. I think you're absolutely right. I had on my good buddy the other day, Taylor, and he just resigned from his police department. And he was saying that, they don't want you, like they have the license plate readers, and it says, oh, this vehicle's stolen. And somebody did a U-turn to go after the thing. And just for the fact that he did a U-turn, nobody hurt, nobody this and that. But yeah, we're not going to chase those cars anymore. We're not going to try to stop them. Just let them go. It's like, so what kind of climate does that create? And then his lieutenant was like, yeah, this guy over here, sure, he doesn't have a round in the chamber. Yeah, he doesn't have his vest on, but he deals with principles really, really well as far as being an SRO and TikTok dances and all this crap. And
Right.
he's like, but
Yeah.
you know, tactically, you're much better than him. Like, well, I'm a better officer than he is, unless being
Yeah.
a good officer means doing TikTok dances.
Yeah.
Dwayne says paper seals replaced by red tape. Boy, ain't that the truth?
Amen, brother.
Amen. Amen. So the first lesson you said was culture. Do you have any additional lessons on that?
Yeah, there's something I'd like to also kind of draw another parallel with. And the Highway Patrol of 1970 was an agency that was growing by leaps and bounds. There had been a program that had been started just years before, where there was an intent to double the size of the Highway Patrol in a matter of a couple of years, because California was a growing, prospering state back then, back in the 1900s, the early 1900s. And the state was growing, and the freeways were growing, and there was a need for more officers to be out there on patrol. So the Highway Patrol wanted to double its authorized strength within a matter of a couple of years. And so there was a huge hiring surge at the Highway Patrol during this time. And so what happened is that the culture developed within the Highway Patrol, where you had very, very young and very inexperienced officers that were being promoted to levels of positions of authority, like field training officers, without having a proper amount of experience. And so you had very rookies, essentially, that were training brand new officers coming right out of the academy. And you didn't have those seasoned veterans there to be able to teach the ropes to the new kids that were coming in. And so at Newhall, all of these officers, I think the most experienced officer, if I remember right, about 18 months of service at the time.
Wow.
They were killed. They had been taught by FTOs barely 5 to 6 months ahead of them out of the academy in some cases. And so you had the young kids that were inexperienced, didn't know the job, didn't have enough experience and maturity to really know the job well, that were responsible for teaching these officers how to do the job. And so as a result, there were big gaps in training and proficiency and competency and skill. And we see that right now. We've got a law enforcement profession right now that's in a state of flux. The trend of the last, call it again, let's be generous and say maybe 5 or 6 years, and it probably goes back further than this. But the recent trend in law enforcement is that anybody with any kind of experience or seniority is getting out of the profession, or they're going to an agency somewhere where they're not going to have to deal with the crap they got to deal with at their current agency. And so we've got this big experience drain in law enforcement right now. And we're all seeing the result of this war on cops that we've been facing for the last several administrations. And so we've got a profession that nobody wants to go into anymore. Young, promising candidates that we would like to see go into the law enforcement profession are being discouraged from doing so by many different methods. And so we've got huge vacancies and huge manpower shortages in these agencies. And the people that are coming through the door are people oftentimes that we wouldn't have considered for the job in prior years. Standards were more rigorous. And so we've got agencies that are by and large very young, very inexperienced. The experienced guys are going out the door, leaving a bunch of young kids there to work with each other. And so oftentimes we've got, once again, FTOs, sergeants, people that are responsible for training and leading their troops that don't have the requisite maturity and experience to do so. And so we're seeing this same pattern that we saw in CHP of 1970 getting repeated across our profession right now for a variety of reasons. And that will lead to problems like we're seeing here, where you have young officers that are making tactical mistakes and getting themselves hurt. And that's not something that we want, obviously. So the graybeards that are with the profession, bless you for being there and sticking it out. But they're getting farther and farther between. There's fewer and fewer of them. And I don't mean to I don't mean to stereotype or anything like that and insinuate that all of our officers out there are young and inexperienced and incapable of doing the job these days, because I work with these guys as a trainer. I'm continuously impressed with, the quality of some of the people that I'm seeing out there. But we would be lying if we weren't going to be honest enough and tell ourselves that, hey, the reality is that in a lot of agencies, we've got a lot of people out there that are not ready to do the job. And they've been habituated to not wanting to do the job. We've got the de-policing that's going on across the nation. And in a lot of agencies, guys will spend their entire shift just essentially trying to avoid calls for service, right? They'll respond to the ones that they're required to go to, but there's no proactive policing going on in a lot of portions of America. And I think a lot of those skills are being lost. One of the stories that I wrote about at Revolver Guy was the killing of Officer Scott Goodell in NYPD in the 1980s. And Scott got killed in the course of conducting a foot pursuit after an armed bad guy. And he wound up rounding a corner, chasing a guy down an alley. And as he rounded the corner, he came under ambush from the bad guy that had chosen a position to cover in that alley. And Scott was killed in that alley by the bad guy. And one of the things I talked about in there is that, these policies that we have about no foot pursuits and things like that are taking hold in lots of agencies. I understand why some of these departments and some of these cities and so forth are adopting policies like that. But there's going to come a day when we're going to start expecting officers to start chasing bad guys again. And when we do, we're going to have a crop of officers that don't have the skills, don't have the experience to do it anymore. We haven't been chasing bad guys for the last 10 years. Now you expect us to do it, and that they don't understand the tactics involved. They don't understand how to do it properly. And so there's going to be that training deficit, that experience deficit. And we're going to get people hurt. When we decide to want to start policing in America again, there's going to be a lot of atrophy of a lot of these skills that we traditionally associate with policing. And guys have been raised in environments where they're not expected to do any kind of proactive policing. And when we finally flip the switch and we want them to do it, there's going to be a lot of people that are going to get hurt because they don't have the background to do it.
No, I absolutely agree with you. I absolutely agree with you. Our good friend, Mr. Will Wood, is on. He says, hey, guys, sorry I'm late. We're just happy you're here, brother.
Hey,
Rick Montana is on. Says, greetings from Montana. Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. And I think this slide has been going on for quite some time. And the people that are elevated to positions of leadership within the community, and of course, I'm not talking across the board because I've interviewed a lot of phenomenal leaders in law enforcement. But when I say 51% or more, if they're not a direct DEI hire, which is call it what it is, if they're not that, then they're risk averse and incredibly timid. And that's how they got to that position. They didn't ruffle any feathers. They went along to get along. They didn't do anything that would put them under this IA spotlight or anything. And now they're in a position of authority. So you have a lamb leading lions, the few lions that are actually on the job anymore. And it's there. I don't know that there's an agency out there right now that's running it probably any higher. And I'm talking about large agencies, any higher than 80%. And this is another thing that blows my mind of my friends that are still out there doing good work, is all the administrative positions are fully staffed. But patrol, which should be the forward facing of the department, the thing that has to get done, is not getting done. Patrol might be running, and it's mandatory overtime again this week, gents. It's like you're just burning these guys out. And when they make a poor tactical decision, they're going to pay for it in blood, or the agency's going to pay for it, or, and then we're going to blame them. And like, well, damn, guy's got like 40 hours of overtime this week.
We've seen that, right? We had an LA County Sheriff's deputy that was killed here within the last year, where he was, like many deputies assigned down there, was continuously getting mandatory overtime and was just physically exhausted, mentally, physically exhausted. And he was zoning out for a second while he was parked at a stoplight. And as he was waiting for the light to change, vehicle pulled up alongside, and the occupant of the vehicle shot him right through the driver's window of the vehicle that he was driving. And our deputy died right there. And the family sued the department and sued the county rather, saying that, they had created conditions that were unsafe working conditions for the deputies there because they were driving to the point of exhaustion, that they were no longer alert on duty. And I think that's a credible argument that they were making. That, of course, is an ongoing thing down there, and we probably won't get any resolution on that anytime soon. But I think any reasonable observer of the law enforcement culture right now understands that people are getting run ragged. Agency manning is terrible. I've got buddies that are telling me about some nights where they've got 2 officers working the entire city, in patrol, and at a time when you would normally have with full manning a dozen officers out, they've got 2. I've got buddies in county sheriff's departments that are telling me that they've got one guy that's covering 500 square miles every night, and you can't do that.
Hell
and
no.
These guys are thinly manned, they're overworked, and they're working under intense political pressures, and it's an impossible situation for the guys that are out there doing the job right now. And something has to give. Something has to give. And I think we're getting to that point. Here in California, it's crazy enough that the people that created this problem are now actually championing solutions to it. We've got our governor, who created many of these problems, is now trying to put himself out there as the savior of the people and signing legislation that's going to try to undo some of the sins that he committed. And I think he's only doing that because he's starting to feel the political heat, where the citizens are finally had enough of this. And he realizes that if he wants to salvage anything left of his political career, he's going to have to start being tough on crime. He's the original perpetrator that made us soft on crime. And so I think that the tide is changing in a certain ways. If we're seeing people like him suddenly decide that they want to start enforcing the law, people like the San Francisco mayor, who's now clamoring for additional restrictions and penalties for commercial theft. When they were celebrating the end of prosecutions for those kind of things over the last several years, I think those are visible signs that the public's had enough and the politicians didn't want to it. And so I'm hoping what this is eventually going to lead to will be a rejuvenation of our commitment to law enforcement in America, and get these officers and these deputies, these highway patrolmen, the resources that they need to actually get out there and do the job properly, and the support that they need to do the job right.
Yeah. Tony says until you get rid of absolute immunity for political prosecutions, things are going to get worse before they get any better. And Will says, we had a town where the whole police force just turned in their resignation. Today is their last day working. And yeah, there was a case where, I don't know if it's a year ago, where I think there was one person on duty in New Orleans. This kid is like, wait a minute, there's nobody else covering it. And he said, well, I'm the only guy. And he just quit right there. I'm like, I can't do this. Are you kidding me? New Orleans is one of the most dangerous places on earth. And he's one guy in a patrol car all by himself. This is insanity. And this is what pisses me off about that. Like I said, you got this bloated administration. So it's like a mushroom, and they're all making all this money. They're in bed that night and things this thing, not taking any risks. If there's one person, then hey, captain, chief, under chief, deputy chief, all y'all get in a cruiser and go. That's what leadership looks like, but they're not going to do that. Will says,
well, and as you've discussed, there are some agencies where you wouldn't put those administrators out on the street because they didn't know how to do the job to start with.
Amen. Yeah, and they're going to get found out as soon as they do that. And I think this is probably a good segue to talk to you about one of the things I've been very excited to talk to you about, Mike, and that is you've spoken about the turbulent 1960s and the terrorism of the left back then, whether it's MOVE or the Sudanese Liberation Army, the Weathermen, the Black Panthers, etc. We could all go on. Do you see a correlation to our current political climate?
I want to tell you a story about a Democratic convention in Chicago. So in the months leading up to the Democratic convention, you had a president who bowed out of the race under pressure from his party because they felt that he wasn't going to win election again. So the vice president, who had not run in any party primaries, inherited all of the electoral votes for the president and became the party's nominee. At the convention, they had one of the strong themes that ran throughout the convention was that we had to put an end to the war overseas, and we had to stop the bombing and the killing of innocent people. And it got to the point where the protesters were raising the flag of these foreign entities, and they clashed with the police violently about it in their protests. There was a strong anti-Semitic current that ran throughout the convention. What year am I talking about?
Sounds like you could be talking about right now, but
yeah,
anybody
yeah,
who's have a little bit of historical context. Yeah,
could be 2024. Could also be 1968.
That's exactly right.
And this is the DNC in Chicago of 1968 as much as it is the DNC of Chicago of 2024. And in 1968, President Johnson bowed out under pressure from his party because the war in Vietnam was not going well, and they wanted him out. So Vice President Humphrey took all the electoral votes. He'd never run in a party primary anywhere, but just inherited the votes and became the de facto nominee for the party. The violent demonstrations in the streets from radicals in the streets were mostly centered about the Vietnam War and the resistance to the Vietnam War. And there were factions within the Democratic Party that wanted an immediate halt to the bombing in Vietnam. And they were raising the Viet Cong flag in the streets while they were clashing with the police nightly in violent protest. And on the convention floor, there are, some very physical altercations as well between various factions within the party. The anti-Semitism was running strong in 1968 DNC. There was a very notable exchange by a Jewish senator who was in the process of nominating a platform for Senator McCarthy. And Abraham Ribicoff was assaulted verbally by then Chicago Mayor Richard Daley with a bunch of anti-Semitic slurs in a very public fashion. And so, strong current of anti-Semitism that was running through, just like there is right now with the 2024 DNC. So, what's old is new again. And, here we are. The fact is that if we look back at the violent, tumultuous history of the 1960s and 1970s, there are many, many parallels between what we experienced then and now, because we were doing the same thing. From a historical perspective, America was in a cultural revolution. The old guard, if you will, that greatest generation that survived the Great Depression and World War II, and they were the captains of industry, and our political leadership, and the center of our culture. They were in a battle for their culture with a young radical group that was coming up, and so we had these violent clashes in our society where we're trying to figure out what America looked like. And we're going through that now, I think, in many regards. We're seeing a continuation of that in some ways. The young violent radicals of the 1960s and 1970s were frustrated by their inability to effect change because they weren't part of the system. And so they were trying to destroy the system from outside. And what these young violent radicals realized after banging their heads against the wall for the better part of a decade and a half is that if they became the system, it was a lot easier to change things and to do the things that they wanted to. And so these young radicals that were in the streets, that were burning stuff and breaking stuff and having violent clashes with the police, they became university professors, and they became deans They became CEOs. They became mayors. They became councilmen. They became presidents. And they brought their same radical ideologies with them and co-opted the system. And so now here we are in the 2020s, and we're seeing these same types of fights over the same types of issues, and we're having this cultural revolution. But the difference is this time, the adults in the room are not the World War II generation with traditional American values. The adults in the room are the radicals, and they're the ones that are pulling the power. And so that's the new fight that we're having in America right now. There's a street artist who's popular for his conservative street art, and he has a saying that Republican is the new punk. And that's kind of where we're at, right? You know, the conservatives in American culture now, they're the radicals that are trying to take their country in a different direction. And the ones that are running the show are the former radicals from the 60s and the 70s. And so a lot of these themes that we're seeing and we're dealing with today are just kind of repeats from before, because it's the same people and the same ideology.
You know, to speak to what you're saying, me and my brother were driving around in his Jeep down Duval Street here in Key West yesterday. I think it was yesterday or the day before yesterday, and we were listening to some Rage Against the Machine came on satellite radio, and
Yeah.
we're like, how did it go? Rage Against the Machine went from F you, I won't do what you tell me, to F you, do what the government tells you. I mean,
yeah, put your damn mask on.
Yeah, that's the new left. I mean, it's insane.
Yeah.
These are the people that didn't trust the government, but oh, look what happens once they control the levers of power.
Yeah.
Now it's, hey, F you, put your damn mask on. It's like, make sure you got 6 feet between you and that, whatever. So you bring up a great point, which I really don't think I had considered, and that is the greatest generation. I mean, we went through, like you said, the late 60s, 70s was terrible. Carter just was the cherry on top for this mess. And then you have the Reagan era. Can we look forward to a Reagan-esque kind of era coming in at some point, or are we just screwed? I mean, I don't know a good way to say it.
I hope so. You know, I mean, I pray for that every night. And of course, you know, we talk about this cycle of history, and you know, we talk about what's old again, what's old is new again, and everything. And you know, the cycle, if it turns, eventually we're going to see, you know, that shift, right? So we've come far left, and so now we've got to see that pendulum swing back towards the center and perhaps towards the right again. So my hope is that we will see another Reagan revolution in our lives. And perhaps that's what we're seeing right now play out in front of us. You know, things look different, right? When this history, when this cycle of history repeats, it's not exactly the same, right? It's different faces, it's different names, it's perhaps a different twist on the issues and stuff like that. So we're never going to see another Ronald Reagan again, because the America that Ronald Reagan came from doesn't exist anymore. But we will see perhaps a Reagan-esque figure, and perhaps we're looking at him in the ultimate outsider right now, right? You've got President Trump. He's not part of the system, never was part of the system, which is why he was hated so much by his own people as well as his political opponents, right? You know, he spent more time fighting his own party in the first 2 years of his presidency than he did fighting the Democrats, because he's the outsider, and he threatened the establishment. And so, you know, perhaps we are seeing the birth of the next Reagan revolution and the MAGA movement. The group of people want to see a return to sound fiscal policy, to you know, a different direction socially, culturally. Want to see crime punished and see laws enforced. Want to disconnect ourselves from being the world's policeman and getting stuck in an endless series of wars and nations that we may not have any kind of direct interest in. And so, you know, perhaps this is This is the next Reagan revolution. You know, Reagan came to power, for the youngsters in the audience. Reagan came to power right after the malaise of the Carter years. And if you look at where America was at in the era of Jimmy Carter, the economy was in shambles. You know, we're suffering from stagflation, recession combined with inflation. And unemployment was at record highs. Inflation was at record highs. The purchasing power of the dollar was particularly low. Our military was weak. It was a paper tiger. It was a hollow force. We had just suffered.
Drug use was rampant. I mean, people have no idea. It was
rampant.
You still had McNamara's Million that was making up the bulk of the NCO Corps. I mean, it was just a nightmare. Racial shootings on bases. I mean, horrible.
Racial riots. You know, we had race riots at the base where I spent much of my career. There were race riots there throughout the 1970s in the dormitories between the airmen. Morale was low. There was no discipline in the force. Training sucked. The equipment was worn out and it sucked. So, you know, we were a paper tiger. The cultural scene in America was in shambles. Drug use throughout the nation was, at a record pace. Crime was off the hook. So, America was in a really, really bad spot. The hostages, the American embassy had been taken hostage by the radical revolutionaries in Iran, and they're mocking us for hundreds of days with our prisoners being stuck over there. And America was ready for a change. America was ready. The people in America were tired of the dysfunction. They were tired of the poor economic conditions. They were tired of not being respected in the world. They were tired of their communities looking like war zones. Anybody that spent any time in the major urban areas in the United States and during this period remembers, it just looked like war zones. And so, Americans were tired of it and they wanted to change. And along came a candidate in Ronald Reagan that promised that America hadn't seen its best days yet, and that we could restore the greatness that is America. And he did it in a hopeful and a positive way that influenced people. And he accomplished what he set out to do. The Reagan plan centered on decreasing the tax burden to the American people, decreasing government spending, decreasing government regulation so that it could free the economic engine of American capitalism. And he created a economic turnaround that Clinton was still writing decades later, and claiming credit for. And so, he was able to turn things around for America. He was the right man at the right time to turn things around. And I think that perhaps we are starting to approach that rock bottom in America right now, where we realize that things aren't going the way that they should be, and that we need somebody like the new Ronald Reagan to come in and help us redirect where we're going. And so I pray for that person all the time. I think that's why it was so frightening when we had the attempted assassination of President Trump here recently, because a lot of people have put their faith and their hope in him being that turnaround kid that's going to lead America into a better day. And so to see how close we came to losing that man really frightened a lot of people.
I don't think threats against the 45th president are over. And I on this show, I try to say 45th president because that T word comes with a lot of baggage. It can rile up the most. I mean, it's so strange how, if you would have told me that, hey, we need to put Trump derangement syndrome in the DSM, that's a real medical condition that people need to be treated for. They need help. I would have laughed. But now it seems, because I know some friends that are people that I would consider friends that they're just hysterical with fear. And I maybe I'm not as maybe I'm a bit more pessimistic than you are. I think we're going to have to go through at least 4 to 6 more years of hell to get to that.
We might.
Hopefully that Reagan rescue kind of thing. I hope I'm wrong.
We might. We very well might.
Yeah.
And Trump is a divisive figure. There's no two ways about it. Let's face it. I mean, he does things and says things that I don't approve of at times. I wish he would learn to keep his mouth shut about certain things. He's a New Yorker.
Yeah.
So, but the thing is that if we divorce the man from the policy and we look at what happened for America and we look at the policies, at the end of the 45th president's term, we had record low unemployment. The economy was booming. The American economic engine was on fire. The stock market was soaring. The companies that had been sitting on the sidelines and refusing to invest in capital improvements and everything for the better part of the entire Obama presidency suddenly had a reason to feel that it was worth investing again in capital development. And so we were returning industry back to the United States. We were an exporter of gas and oil instead of an importer of gas and oil. The steel industry was starting to return to America. Instead of us importing steel, we were making our own steel. We had tariffs in place that were going to encourage further development and growth in the auto industries and so forth. And, if we look at those things, crime was at lows, right? We had, a turnaround and as far as that's concerned. So, America was in pretty good shape.
Yeah.
And
I tell you, Mike, I've told people, I said, if I listed the accomplishments of the 45th president, and then they're like, oh, what do you think about that? And my liberal friends, the few that I do have still, like, man, that sounds fantastic. Yeah, that's Trump, the one and they would just immediately boil over.
There was no war in the Middle East, right? Instead, we had 3 peace treaties signed in the Middle East.
What did exactly? That was what I was going to say. Obama gets the Nobel Prize for peace just for having a pulse, whereas
participation trophy.
Exactly. Whereas Trump actually got some shit done. Pardon my French, and he will be vilified by a certain segment. John Hearn says, if you can't spend all day with Mike, I highly recommend Days of Rage by Brian Burrow, same author as Public Enemies. I will definitely have to check that.
Yeah, fantastic book.
I have not read that, so I definitely have to put that on my wish list. We talked about historic parallels. Obviously, you did a fantastic job of reminding us that 1968 Chicago, identical set of circumstances. Now, things have changed, not just culturally, but technology has changed. A lot of things have changed. Like you said, the greatest generation, unfortunately, have left us. But what kind of vector, to use your words, Mike, does that put our nation on? And I want to be specific when I talk about that. The next 6 months, let's say from now, Mike, until the next 18 to 24 months, what vector are we on, sir?
I don't know. I really don't know. I think we'll have a better idea once we start counting the votes in November, where we're going. I honestly think that there are large segments of America that are waking up. They're kind of getting red pilled, if you want to use the current lingo. They're waking up to the reality around them, and they're realizing that things are not going well. They want to go in a different direction. The question is whether or not they will be active enough and vocal enough to make sure that those changes that they want happen. And, without being too critical of my fellow Americans, I'll say that as a culture, we've gotten fat, lazy, and stupid. And we aren't willing to do the work sometimes to get things done. And so, and part of that is the result of forces that we're discussing here. We've got the education system in America was co-opted. And so those radical revolutionaries that we talked about that were in the streets rioting and so forth in the 60s and 70s, well, they became your child's teachers. They became the deans and the professors and the academics. And so they have been educating several generations worth of children now that are now deficient in their knowledge of American history, civics, economics. And so you have a voting base in America that is no longer well versed and well educated. And so you've got a lot of folks that are very susceptible to the suggestions of things like social media or, popular culture. And they will make voting decisions based off of things like that rather than their knowledge of economics, of their understanding of world dynamics of history and politics and use of force in the world. And so you've got an electorate that is not well suited to make good, rational, analytical choices now. A lot of it is based on emotion and based on emotional influence. And so where we're at when we start counting votes in November will determine a lot of what, things are going to look for here. I think I'm seeing positive indications that Americans are tired of where we're at and that they want something better. And I think that we're seeing, at least in certain demographics in America, we're seeing some shift in the vote behavior of people, right? It's suppressed by all of your media outlets as much as they can. But from what we can gather, it seems like, certain demographics in America, let's take the Black voting population. It seems like we're seeing some significant trends in their voting behavior and the candidates they're most likely to support. I think there's a lot of Blacks in America that are understanding that it's time to get off the Democrat plantation and to be big again. And they understand that these policies that have been promoted ever since Lyndon Johnson's Great Society have been damaging for them, not helpful. And so I think that we're starting to see, some of these shifts. We're starting to see, again, the signs like I was talking about, where a radical governor who has been soft on crime is suddenly deciding that he has to appear to be tough on crime in order to salvage his political future. I think that's a pretty good indicator right there that the American people are starting to get tired of the rampant violence and the rampant crime that they're seeing in their communities. So, he's worried enough about how they're going to vote that he's willing to try to reimagine himself in the public side. I think that's a pretty good indicator right there that we're going to see some changes in the voting patterns and the trends. So I'm hopeful that we see a strong voter turnout for this election that will elect leaders up and down the ticket, not just the presidential level, but at the local levels, that will turn things around and bring America back in a direction towards prosperity and towards greater peace. Because, there's a lot of strife in America right now, and a lot of it's manufactured trying to pit America against Americans. And there's value in that. And for people that have certain motivations, this chaos is an essential element in promoting the radical change they want. I mean, we talked about the groups, earlier. I mentioned the Weathermen, the SDS, La Raza, Venceremos, Black Panther Party, African National Congress. I mean, any number of these radical groups in the 60s and 70s. At the heart of all of these organizations was a Marxist communist orientation. And what they hoped to achieve by the chaos that they were creating in the street was a desire amongst Americans for the type of Marxist revolution that these groups wanted. And a certain level of chaos is necessary for people to demand radical change and to accept radical change. And so these groups were out rioting in the streets and causing all these commotions because they wanted to encourage that cultural revolution. They wanted that communist revolution to occur. And I think that we're seeing the same types of things happening right now. The people that would like to be in power, that would like to pull the strings, that would like to control the system, if you will, they need a certain level of chaos in order for their radical ideas to be accepted. And so I think that's really what we're seeing and playing out in front of us right now in America. That's why we've got governors that are releasing felons from prisons and dumping them into your communities. That's why we have a border that is non-existent, so that we can let all kinds of criminals and ne'er-do-wells across the border, whether they be terrorists or organized units of enemy armies or cartels or you name it. So all of these things that promote chaos are good for the people that would like to support radical changes. The fundamental transformation of America, as we heard from a former president of the United States. Well, you don't fundamentally transform America until you get Americans willing to accept some pretty radical ideas. And the only way that you do that is you make them afraid enough of their future that they are willing to take and accept those radical ideas. And so that's kind of what we're seeing play out in front of us here.
Craig Holland over there in the UK, it's a great point. Says we voted for change, and in the last month we have been screwed over worse than before. Be careful what you wish for. As I understand it, Craig, most Britons have been voting for, go all the way back to Tony Blair and perhaps beyond, to stem, if not stop, a lot of this immigration that's going on in your country. And it seems to, and they voted that way, and yet it has only gotten worse. And then sadly, I think the lesson for us here in America should be, look what happens when you lose your Second Amendment. Second Amendment goes, and then the First Amendment goes. And now if you retweet something, you got somebody, a thought police, knocking on your door to take you away. And your point about releasing people, the UK is doing the same thing. Kerr is going to reduce the population, I think, by 40 to 50% in order to make room for every grandmother who retweeted something. This is the level of dystopia, and I certainly did not think I would see in my lifetime. And I hate that. My wife and my family were just in the UK in January. We love going over there, but I don't know that I can go there now. I think it's lost. And that doesn't mean there's not good people like Craig. The country is filled with amazing, amazing people. But until that you guys sort out what's going on at the top, it's going to get worse. And I want to speak to something that you said. You were talking about the left controlling the education system and how America's getting dumber and making less decisions based on facts and more on emotion. And it reminded me, every couple of years, you'll hear that, I don't know if it's the APA or who does it, but they're constantly renorming the mean IQ. Oh, it's slipped down to 98. Okay, we'll renorm that to the new 100. It's slipped down to 97. Okay, we'll renorm that to the new 100. Before you know it, you've gone an entire standard deviation. So the average American, instead of being a true 100, is actually 85. So, and these are people that are going to have a hard time holding their jobs. These are people that maybe shouldn't be making long-term personal decisions. I'm not talking about eugenics or some sort of authoritarian thing. What I'm saying is we need to go back to the schools. And if you look at, I recently found my grandmother's 8th grade curriculum. It was her report card from Cave Creek, Tennessee. And I'll tell you just some of the subjects on there. It was United States history. This is 8th grade. Civics 1, Civics 2, the Constitution, Tennessee history. And of course, then you had reading, writing, and arithmetic kind of thing. But it was like, this was the foundation, right? Was the civics, the Constitution, the rule of law, governance, and these things that it's like, that ain't talked about at all. We already cleaned the slate of that. So, at this point, what do you do? It's going to take a hard shift, and it's not going to happen in one voting cycle. It's going to take generational change. And then add on top of that, and this is where I want to go with this, Mike, what do you do when you take these problems we have? Now, again, this is where the parallel of the 1968 kind of really breaks down, and then throw into this mix 11 to 25 million. We're talking about real numbers at some point, undocumented illegal immigrants of all strata, from Chinese to people from Uzbekistan. I think there was like 30-something thousand of those folks here, many of which will never take on board our values. What the hell do you do with those folks, Mike?
It's a great question, and it's something that we're going to have the rest of our lives to figure out here. The the disorder that we're seeing at our border is one of the greatest threats to American sovereignty and the survival of the American culture right now. It is not feasible to expect Americans to be able to vote their way out of these current problems if they have a system that is not fundamentally sound, that allows people that are not American citizens to vote. And we know that that's happening, right? We know that there are people that are American citizens that have come here illegally. They're being registered to vote. And even if they're not being registered to vote, their mere presence affects the voting process, because when we start doing things like census counts and so forth, we start allotting representatives based on the population of a region, and illegals get counted in that census, and they count towards a representation. So, it is a fundamental assault on the integrity of the voting system in America to allow millions of non-citizens into the United States, and to allow them to have this influence on voting. And when you start taking a look at all of the other elements that could potentially be fraudulent in an election, with all of the absentee voting and all of the lack of controls and so forth on that, it can be very damaging. And where we have to start, some of these problems are so large that you can't possibly attack them head on, right? So we have to start breaking this down into manageable bites. We got that eat the elephant one piece at a time, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so one place that we can all start in our own lives is that we can become better citizens ourselves. We can understand the basics of civics and of U.S. history, so that we can now in turn explain them to our neighbors in a clear fashion. And when we have those conversations around the water cooler at work, we can be the guy that corrects the misunderstandings, and we can be the guy that corrects the conversation and brings it back into reality instead of fiction. And we can do that and have an influence in a small environment, and then try to promote that as it grows larger. One of the things that you'll hear frequently right now, and we got a belly full of it this last week at the DNC, was about protecting democracy. And we have to protect the American democracy, against all of these threats and everything. That's the tagline left right now: promoting democracy, protecting democracy. Well, if you do a man on the street interview with most Americans, and you ask them, hey, what kind of government do we have in the United States? Probably 9 out of 10 will tell you that we got a democracy, right?
Right.
We don't have a democracy. We have a constitutional republic. And there's a big difference between a constitutional republic and a democracy. The difference is the difference between the mob and between a group of citizens that all agree on a certain set of foundational principles. And we agree that the society that we are going to be a part of is to be governed by those principles, and that we all mutually pledge our solidarity in observing those principles, protecting those rights and those liberties, and governing our society according to those mutually accepted laws. And that's where things break down when you have these cultural revolutions here. If Americans can't decide between right and wrong, if they can't decide on the fundamental constitutional liberties that are worth protecting, then the constitutional republic breaks down. And that's what we're starting to see. The Constitution that the forefathers put together had a very, very limited role for federal government, because they were worried about the federal government becoming too large and becoming too powerful and becoming too authoritarian, because they had lived through that experience. They'd lived through that experience in England and the other places they came. And so they wanted protections against that. And so they very purposely set forth a constitutional republic based on the limited role of government and the granting not of individual rights by government to the people, but merely an acknowledgement that the people have inalienable rights that are given to them by God that government cannot transgress upon. And if we can't agree on those types of basics, then we can't save the American system. And so all of this starts with us understanding those types of things. Understanding we don't have to all go out and read Locke and drag our philosophy books out and read Locke and the founding documents. It would be kind of nice if people might be familiar with the Federalist Papers and what was written in them by our founding fathers, so they can understand the intentions that they had when they created our nation. But we do understand, the basics of what it takes to be a good citizen. We need to understand the basics of U.S. history. And so now we can detect those aberrations when we want, when we're looking at people that are suggesting ideas like price controls. When we have a presidential candidate that suggests price controls, well, we need to have a little bit of education to understand that price controls is an anti-democratic idea, and that is a fundamental precept of economic and political systems like Marxism and communism that is incompatible with the freedom we enjoy as Americans. And so we need to understand those things and to be able to identify those things. That begins with us starting on improving our own education to start with, and then we can now go and help others understand that.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I think I would love to see if Trump comes back in for another round, it would be Department of Education, clean house, clean the slate, and let's start over from scratch as if we never had anything. Because bolting on something else is just at this point it's not going to work. And
that's a state level function.
I know, right? So just tear it up,
Yeah.
be done with it. And I want to go back to something else you said. You mentioned tariffs maybe 30 minutes ago. And when we talk about educating our fellow citizens, like, what do you think we did before we start collecting taxes in 1913 or whatever? Hey, Bob, what do you think we did back then? We did something. What do you think that was? Like, it was tariffs. And you watch how tariffs have just fallen off like this as the rate of federal income tax is just, they've crossed each other at some point very early on once they started collecting federal income tax. And Congress is supposed to do that. And I love the fact that Donald Trump's like, yeah, I'm going to bring it back. Well, what a fantastic idea. And but it might be too expensive to import some things. Yeah, then we can start building things again here instead of using cheap Chinese steel.
The Americans have to get now.
Exactly. Amazing. So, there's so much I want to go. And I've kept you on here almost 2 hours, but if I could, one more question for you, Mike, and this is going to be just a softball question. And that is, what is the most plausible existential threat, whether that's to the world, to the West, to the nation? Is there something that kind of keeps Mike Wood up at night?
Oh God, there's a lot that keeps Mike Wood up at night. I think the cultural rot and decay that we're seeing is what concerns me the most. Because if we're not a good people, if we're not a moral people, then our future is ordained for us. It's not going to be a pretty picture, right? It's not going to be good. And so we need to have more responsibility. We need to have more accountability. We need to have more integrity in our system of government and our own individual lives. And, I talked earlier about that voter, that American voter, and that American voter, the typical average American voter out there, they're not as educated as they should be to preserve the system of government we have. Franklin was asked shortly after they walked out of the Constitutional Convention, sir, what type of government have you given us? Republic, if you can keep it. And it takes a moral, educated public to maintain that republic. And so when I see the cultural rot, if you take a look at just, popular culture in America right now, and it's awful. And there's a lot of emphasis on individual morality and integrity and so forth. And if we allow ourselves to corrupt from within, then the future of our nation is hopeless. And so America and our constitutional republic survives if we have citizens that are worthy of it. And so that's what really concerns me right now, is that we've got a lot of elements in our society right now that they're not moral people. They're not good people. And there's a lot of evil that creeps into our daily life. And it's very difficult for us to imagine a positive future for America if we allow this kind of evil to take root in our families and in our hearts. And so I think there's a whole lot that we need to do to focus on being good people, being moral, being good people. And if we can do that, we can right the ship. But if we can't fix our own house, then there's no way that we're going to fix the nation's house.
Do you see, and I promise, I said I wouldn't ask you another question like that, because to me, at some level, if that does not work, are we heading toward some sort of national divorce, secession, disillusionment, balkanization? I mean, we're seeing it right now where California, for the first time in its history, is not growing. It has a net loss, as I understand it. So, and I see that here in Tennessee, or anywhere I go in the South, and that is people coming in from elsewhere. And it's not just finance. I mean, obviously Tennessee doesn't have a state tax, and there's a whole lot of other great things financially with Tennessee and Texas and Florida. But I think it's also wanting to be around other like-minded folks. Now, if that voting continues and that population migration accelerates, then at some point, it seems like it's just a math problem at some point where I don't want anything to do with you people.
Yeah, I live that every day. We've got issues in my state right now where, like you said, the math problem is very real. We've got problems with a uniparty in California. It's been a single Democrat party rule for decades in California. And so I very much feel like I'm living in occupied territory here, where oftentimes I feel like my vote is not particularly meaningful. And so I understand, that desire to leave and to go to places where you're surrounded by your tribe and to try to concentrate that political power and affect change locally. Do I still have you? It looks like we might be frozen.
Yeah, I have you, but you appear frozen on mine.
Okay. Yeah.
Maybe I'm frozen. I have no idea.
Yeah. So anyhow, that's a real thing. And the people that live out there in, am I still connected with you?
Yes, sir. Yep.
All right. Here we go. My screen just went completely blank. I think we're back now. The people who live out in America are kind of tired of California expats coming there and saying, this place is wonderful. Change everything. We'll change it all.
Exactly.
You talk about the breakdown of American culture and the elements of American culture getting pitted against each other. And a lot of times when people discuss things like the potential for a civil war or something like that, they'll talk about, you'll have a states versus states or something like that. And I honestly don't think it plays out that way. If we get to another dark period in our history where a second civil war happens, it's going to be urban versus rural, I think. I think that's where the dividing lines break down. It's not going to be California and Oregon and Washington versus Texas and everybody else. It's going to be, those red flyover countries versus those blue urban areas on the electoral maps, and so I pray that we don't get to that point. Now, I have my dark moments and my pessimistic moments where I just don't see a way that we avoid some type of cataclysmic confrontation, because that seems to be the way that the inertia is taking everything. But in my more hopeful moments, I see, positive signs that we can kind of stop that train wreck from happening if, we do the proper things. But what I will say is that the nature of revolution is, if as a historian, if we take a look at the nature of revolution, it's very rare that we see anything good or better that springs forth from any kind of revolution. You know, we didn't see it after the French Revolution. We didn't see it after the Russian Revolution. The American Revolution was very exceptional, just like America is exceptional in history, because we built something much better from the ashes of revolution in America. And that's not how it normally goes. Americans are kind of preconditioned to think that things get better after revolution because that's been our experience, but that's not the experience of history. And so anybody that's too anxious or too interested in promoting armed conflict between American citizens here as a way to fix our problems, I don't think they have a proper appreciation of the historical record. And they don't understand just how damaging that could be. And that may be something that we really never recover from. There's no guaranteed good output from Americans shooting at Americans. And so it's something that we have to be very cautious about, not be too glib about.
I'm glad you say that, because when I hear people that have never been in war, never been in combat, and they're talking about this kinetic solution, I'm like, bro, I'm willing to die for this. Okay, I get, who are you willing to kill? Who are you willing to shoot for it? When you think about loading that green tip in your magazine, who are you aiming it in on? They're going to look like you. You know, it's going to be another American citizen who has hopes and dreams. And you know, I have come to the conclusion that really, if we're looking at it, it's going to be a third civil war. I think the Revolutionary War, as much as we want to say it was a war against Great Britain, it was really American against American. The loyalist armies, oftentimes a lot of the battles that my ancestors fought in, when I really started looking at them, like, oh, okay, well, my ancestor was there. Let's read about it. It's like, well, there was one British officer on the field and a loyalist army. And nobody, of course, everybody wants to say, yeah, my grandpappy, great-great-great-grandpappy, he got a land grant here in North Carolina or Tennessee or whatever. But nobody says my ancestors were loyalists.
Yeah.
Whereas, but most Americans were loyalists, which is
sure. Well, so, if we believe the folks that have taken a close look at it, maybe as little as 3% of the American population at any time was actually taking up arms against the English government, right? So
exactly,
that's a significant minority of people. There's a lot of people out there that are willing to say, I'm ready to go to war over this thing right now and everything. And those are the same people that you ask them, hey, have you voted in the last 4 elections? Might be kind of disappointed in their answer. So somebody that's not willing to get up off the couch and just vote, or maybe even walk their precinct or put a yard sign out or things supporting a candidate that believes in what they do, or give him $50. Am I really to believe that he's going to take to the field with a pack and a rifle and fight for liberty? If he's not willing to do the easy stuff now, I don't know. So
Craig says we forgive you. And since Craig is on here, there was several of my ancestors and my wife's ancestors fought at the Battle of Kings Mountain. And again, I try to remind my children of this, because where we lived in Beaufort, South Carolina, there's the old Sheldon Church. Google the Sheldon Church ruins. And we used to go there all the time for picnics and stuff. It was burned by the British. The crown burned it and kicked its subjects out during church and burned it to the ground. And then we rebuilt it. And then guess what? The William Tecumseh Sherman, as he moved towards Savannah, he burned it again. So this is their own government burning these things to the ground. And talking about this kinetic, I'm ready to go, bro. Okay, cool. I got that. Well, my ancestors not only killed Major Ferguson, a Scottish officer sent here by the crown to bring those rebel colonists to heel, but then they drug his 2 mistresses out of the tent and shot them both, and buried him and his 2 mistresses, and I think his damn horse, all in the same plot. I don't really want any part of it. I think what we have is worth fighting for, and hopefully we can solve the problem at the ballot box and get our country going back in the right direction. The cultural rot that's going on right now, it doesn't go anywhere good. I don't know.
Well, I think there's a distinct difference between the people that we associate with and the people that we would consider our political enemies.
Mm-hmm.
The people, if you will, if you want to make it an easy division between left and right, the people on the right typically are the ones that have much more experience as military people, law enforcement people, and so forth. And so they see the violence, they see the destruction, they see the death, the ruin, and they have a very good idea of just what it involves when things start going kinetic. Folks on the left don't have that same kind of understanding, and so they are very willing to push and to prod and to poke and try to encourage and to incite. And the left kind of has if you will, a rheostat for violence, where they're willing to turn it up or to turn it down in small increments as however they need to accomplish their political objectives. We saw that throughout 2020. How they were turning up the rheostat, and things were getting they were progressing from the Cold War to the hot war very, very fast throughout 2020. The folks in our world, we don't have a rheostat for violence. We have a switch. It's on or it's off. And we don't want to see what it looks like when the people that are getting poked and prodded and incited by the left finally decide it's time to throw the switch, because it's not gonna end well for them. And but I think there's a certain level of maturity and judgment and reasonableness that exists within our society that we associate with, don't see on the left amongst all of these radicals. And they are very, very willing to bring us right up to the brink of war in an effort to achieve their political objectives. And I think we understand the damages of war, and so we are particularly hesitant to use any kind of force in response. And that's something that they take tactical advantage of. The history of political violence in America, it's always kind of been the left pushing. If we look back to the early 1900s, after the Russian Revolution, mm-hmm. in America, we had a lot of civil unrest throughout the late 1910s and 1920s and 1930s with the socialist revolution in America. We had agricultural riots and farm riots and all these types of things, and labor riots, and it was all incited by leftist Marxist thought. Post World War II, we had the same thing with the Red Scare, and then we had the backlash with the McCarthyism and everything to that. Into the 1960s and 1970s, again, it was the communists that were inciting political violence in the streets of America. Fast forward into the 80s and 90s and the early 2000s, and it was the World Trade Organization, Occupy Wall Street people, all of these groups. That's all leftist inspired violence there. All the conflicts that we had throughout the early part of the 2000s, again, leftist inspired violence. We fast forward into the 2020s, all of the Black Lives Matter and all the rest of that stuff. Again, it's all leftist inspired political violence. That's kind of the nature of things in America, that, we don't see a whole lot of right-wing associated groups out there that are causing the type of large-scale mayhem and destruction and chaos and everything that we see from the left. And that's because, again, like we talked about, they need to create a certain level of chaos in our society to move the needle, to encourage Americans to accept their radical ideas. We don't need to do that on the right. We don't hopefully need to do that on the right, where we don't need to cause chaos and violence to get people to accept our views, because they're already enshrined in our Constitution, and it's conceivably it's still the basis on which our nation operates. But we kind of get further and further down the road, and we stray from that original vision of the founders as to what type of society that we're going to have. Then it may get to the point where there has to be violence that we use to preserve that. But I hope that that's not going to be necessary. I hope that we can use other means to accomplish our objectives.
Yeah, I've had Charles Haywood on here a few times from the Worthy House. I don't know if you follow him at all, but he's talked about the Finnish Civil War being a good model for what we might be looking at, where you have the left doing a lot of the things that you alluded to, Mike, and then it took the right. Once they pushed the LARPing too far, when I think that's what a lot of what we saw in 2020 was. I mean, no disrespect to people that got hurt or the property was burned to the freaking ground in a lot of these urban areas. But a lot of it was just LARPing. And at some point, the right doesn't LARP very well. The right, once the LARPing goes too far, it's going to be shut down. And, but anyway, I've kept you on here over 2 hours, Mike. I want to thank you so much for being on. I've had the pleasure of speaking to Mike Wood today, senior editor at Revolver Guy and author of Newhall Shooting, Tactical Analysis, Survival Lessons from one of the law enforcement's deadliest shootings. Where can people go to find you? Where can they go to pick up your books, Mike?
So the best place to find what I'm writing now is over at revolverguy.com. I'm the senior editor there, and I do a lot of the writing. I also have a talented group of guys that contribute as well. So it's more than just my byline that you'll see there. But if you want to see what I'm writing these days, that's where you'll find it, over at revolverguy.com. For folks that are interested in the Newhall book, probably the best place to go is to the Gun Digest store. And they sell the title there, but you can also find it on Amazon as well and any of the popular selling platforms. But I like to send folks over to the Gun Digest store because they're our publisher and they're good people there, and I like to support our tribe, and so that's where I tend to send folks when they're looking for the book, is the Gun Digest store.
Well, thank you so much, Mike. We need to do this again soon. I echo what everybody's saying here. Craig says, great show. Gerald says, thanks. And Tony says, great show. And thank you so much for being on today, Mike.
Well, I appreciate it, guys. And just ask everybody out there to pray for America. We need it right now. And I'm proud to be associated with you. I'm proud to be associated with this group of people here that were here today. I think we're really the core of what's going to salvage our nation and bring it back into better days. And so I thank everybody for their part in that, and just proud to be with you.
God bless you, Mike. God bless you, everybody that's going to watch today's show or listen to it in the future. And be careful, guys, because the fight is coming. You ready?